That was quick, right? Welcome back to everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. We are about to move into a session that I know we've all been anticipating with a lot of excitement, maybe a little bit of trepidation, and that's okay. Before we move to Jackie, though, I do want to mention two things very quickly. Someone had mentioned in the chat that there are a lot of really great resources being put out there, and I agree. So what we're going to do in the recap email is we are going to provide a transcript of that. We're also going to work to try to make some accommodations for those who might have visual impairments to access that as well, so that you can go back through and take advantage of those resources. Also, I wanted to point out that throughout today, you're going to see some sponsor slides that appear throughout our presentation with statements about that particular company's stance on recent events, racial equity, their views on diversity and inclusion, and I hope that you'll take a pause and take a look at those. Perhaps they might inform your own company's stance or provide a good model for you to follow. So thank you to those companies who provided statements for us to share today, because we're always looking to learn and expand and grow in that area. All right, now we're going to move to our virtual privilege walk. I have the privilege of welcoming Walk West's Director of Multicultural Programming, Jackie Ferguson, who will lead us through a challenging but necessary journey today. With her degree in professional and technical writing and the designation of Certified Diversity Executive, Jackie is a founder of and head of content and programming for the Diversity Movement, a Walk West powered organization that promotes DEI through content, technology, and data. You will find her biography as well as all the bios of all of our speakers today in your program. Thank you so much for being with us, Jackie. We're really looking forward to this.
Emmy, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for participating in a virtual privilege walk. Before we jump into what a privilege walk is, let's talk about the concept of privilege. Oftentimes, people associate privilege with one race or gender or with affluence. However, privilege is reflected in many situations, many lifestyles, and among many demographics. For example, how many of you have had at least one supportive, loving parent? That advantage made life easier for you. You didn't have to fight to discover your personal self-worth because you had someone cheering for you and showing you love even during challenging times. And privileges often have nothing to do with how hard you personally worked. Privilege isn't necessarily a reflection of you as much as it is the perception and assumptions to others of who you are and what you're capable of. Do you feel safe sleeping in your own bed? Going for a jog? Bird watching? What happens when a police officer stops you for a broken tail light? Clearly, not everyone has equal privilege. Thankfully, I think more people are leaning in on the acknowledgement of privilege. And right now, we need people, all people, to use their privilege, their access, their influence, their platforms, and their resources to make systemic changes across our country. And I hope this inspires you to feel empowered with your privilege to do so. So now that we're level set on privilege, let's talk about the privilege walk. This is a little different because traditionally these are done in person. The group stands side by side and takes steps forward or back based on the question of privilege or challenge. And the purpose is to be mindful and present with your individual levels of privilege. Now, some people find them very enlightening, and some don't care for privilege walks because of a perceived embarrassment or conviction with having too much privilege or too many challenges. But I want to offer you an alternate perspective. If you discover higher levels of privilege in this exercise, you're empowered to use your advantages to advocate for equity and inclusion across your organizations and communities. Your voice is so important in allyship. If you find that you've had to overcome significant challenges in your life, you're empowered to inspire others to be empathetic leaders and culture drivers. Working together, we drive DEI forward for all. So let's talk about this virtual privilege walk. I'm going to ask you all to grab a piece of paper. I'll read a series of 40 questions. We will all start with a score of 0. With each question, I'll ask you to add 1 if a particular privilege applies to you. Remember, adding one doesn't mean better than. It simply means you had a specific privilege. And not adding one doesn't mean less than. It simply means you had a specific challenge. Let's take time to grab that paper now. Okay, let's begin. If you are right-handed, add one. If you never had your utilities cut for non-payment while growing up, add one. If someone else paid for you to attend college and not due to your academic or athletic merit scholarships, add one. If you had health insurance and regularly saw your pediatrician as a child, add one. If your primary ethnic identity is American, add one. If there were more than 50 books in your house when you grew up, add one. If you were never called names or were never made to feel uncomfortable from jokes because of your race, class, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, add one. If there were people who worked for your family to provide household assistance, such as cooks, gardeners, or nannies, add one. If you were never ashamed or embarrassed of your clothes, house, car, etc., add one. If one or both of your parents had professional 9-to-5 jobs, such as doctors or engineers, add one. If you have never been the victim of excessive force when pulled over by the police, add one. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, add one. If you never tried to change your appearance, mannerisms, or behavior to avoid being judged or ridiculed, add one. If you studied the culture of your ancestors in elementary school, add one. If you went to school speaking the primary language in which courses were taught, add one. If you never had to skip a meal or were never hungry because there was not enough money to buy food when you were growing up, add one. If you were taken to art galleries or plays by your parents, add one. If your parents were never unemployed or laid off by any reason other than their choice, add one. If you attended private school or summer camp, add one. If your family never had to move because they could not afford the rent, add one. If you were told that you were beautiful, smart, and capable by your parents, add one. If you were never discouraged from academics or jobs because of race, class, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, add one. If you were encouraged to attend college by your parents, add one. If you do not have a visible physical disability, add one. If you do not have an invisible illness or invisible disability, add one. If your family owned the house where you grew up, add 1. If you feel good about how your identities are portrayed in the media, add 1. If you were ever offered a good job or opportunity because of your association with a friend or family member, add 1. If you were never denied employment or paid less because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, add 1. If you ever inherited money or property, add 1. If you did not have to rely primarily on public transportation outside of major cities, add 1. If you were never afraid of or a victim of violence because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, add 1. If you never had to wait more than 20 minutes to be helped in a department store, or were never followed around the store because of your race, add 1. If no one in your family ever served a prison sentence, add 1. If your family has never left your homeland or entered another country for reasons other than your own free will, add 1. If you would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs, add 1. If you have never been spoken over because you could not articulate your thoughts fast enough, add 1. If you have never felt disrespected or ignored because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, add 1. If there was never substance abuse in your household, add 1. If you were never told by your parents that you'd have to work harder than everyone else to get ahead because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, add 1. That's our 40 questions. Please take a moment to share your final numbers in the chat at the bottom of the screen. I'm seeing 35, 9, 23, 18, 24, 27, 37, 15, 32, 28, 10, 34, 30, 40, 17. So many different numbers. And, you know, the thing about understanding where your privilege is, if you notice, none of the questions that were asked had anything to do with how hard you particularly worked. It had to do with things that are outside of your control. And so in a privilege walk, that's something that you have to think of. Privilege, again, isn't necessarily how hard you work, but things that were provided to you and the perception of yourself to others in what you can do, who you are, and what you're capable of. Our moderators are going to share a poll with you right now with 2 questions. Let's examine how we're feeling after that exercise. And if we could add the results of the poll, that would be fantastic. Okay, so most people indicated that it was about what they expected. Great. And then there's one other question in the poll. And if we could share the results when we're ready. Okay. Most people feeling reflective. For those that have other feelings, if you would share those in the chat, I'd like to see what some of those are. I'm seeing undeserving, humbled, heartbroken, empowered, guilty, sad, frustrated. Privilege walks can make us feel a lot of different things. Motivated to use my privilege to help affect change. Fantastic. I'm going to take a few minutes with a couple of our other panelists. I believe it's Alex, Sam, and Daniela to join me. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask live if they would be so kind. And for the 3 of you, what did you realize about yourself after participating in this privilege walk?
I can start. Indifferent. It's just those things that, as being a woman, being a Black woman in America, I expect. And I expect to fight against.
Thank you for sharing that.
Jackie, I think one of the things this privilege walk, and first of all, thank you, but that was really eye-opening. I had a 30, by the way, and I think one of the things this privilege walk really drove home to me is the concept of unconscious privilege. As somebody who has lived a lot of very obvious forms of privilege in my life, I've often felt in the past that I've had a good understanding of my privilege, and something I've been learning recently is that I really don't, and a lot of the privilege that I experience comes in the form of things that I don't have to think about every day that a lot of other people do. And so that's something that I really learned from this.
Thank you. Alex?
Thank you for having me as a volunteer today. I think what I realized most was that my compassion for others is really quite motivating. So,
fantastic. And follow-up question for you all. How can your understanding of privilege or marginalization improve your relationships with others?
Jackie, I'll start. I think those questions are really connected because for one of the things I'm really learning is that in a society where systemic forms of discrimination exist and are so widespread that one person's privilege is very often another person's disadvantage. And so by examining my own forms of privilege, I think and I hope that will help me be more empathetic, help me be a better listener, help me recognize, I'll never know what it's like to live somebody else's experience, but to help me at least try to understand the challenges that other people face so that I can be a better supporter of those people. And and foster conversations in my own life that, are often tough to have, but be better equipped to do that.
I just actually want to read a comment that I see out here from Tamara.
Thanks.
And reading what she says is kind of how I feel. She actually feels grateful that her kids will have higher scores than the scores that I get, just because of the way the things we went through, we can be able to adjust and learn and then make it better for the future for our children. And then hopefully with people and with everything that's going on currently in the world today, people will open their eyes, they will realize, they'll be willing to listen with both ears and then put forth actions in place to make sure that in the future, people will have higher scores.
Thank you, Daniela.
Ironically, what I was reflecting on most during the exercise was my responsibility to my daughter and my civic responsibility to ensure she's a well-rounded individual so she becomes an asset to society. So she's only 7 months old at the moment, but I will be seeking out thoughtfully diverse experiences for her to be raised with.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives and insights on that. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave the group with?
I would just say thank you for this. Thank you for this privilege walk and for this entire event. I had high expectations for it, and it's just exceeded all of them. So I'm very, very humbled to be a part of it.
Thank you so much.
And I definitely want to echo that. Thank you, Jackie, for bringing this forth to us to give us opportunity to think on an individual level of what we see and what we feel and what we know, and then being able to express that and realize like, oh, wow, my number is high or low. How can I change?
Thank you, Daniela. One of the arguments of privilege, as I said, is I've worked hard for what I have, and I'm certainly not disputing that. But if you think back again over the questions, most of the questions are things that were outside of your personal control. So when people say we all have access to the American dream, privilege has us starting our race at different points. We don't all start at the same line. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this virtual privilege walk. I hope it provided you a new perspective on privilege. And remember, we all have aspects of privilege and challenge. Use your privilege to fight for equity, safety, and justice practices wherever you have influences. Thank you for your time today, and good journeys to you all on your DEI paths. Thanks.